Welcome to the Navigating Disruption podcast with Janet Hitchen and myself, Mike Klein. Navigating Disruption is a podcast that aims to help leaders and organizations navigate the disruption that lies ahead. This episode, we speak with Jason Anthoine. There's a lot of talk about employee experience these days, but there's only one consultant in the world who calls himself employee experienced, and that's Jason Anthoine. Jason's long been outspoken about the need for organizations to better connect with their frontline staff, and particularly their blue-collar employees. He's also got a great take on the relationship between communication professionals and courage. Welcome to the Navigating Disruption podcast.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. I'm so excited about this. This is going to be a great conversation.
Before we get started, can we just find out what's on the poster behind you, Jason?
Yes. So I have a rotating stack of signs that I put behind me, and this one's "It's up to you." Just as a subtle reminder, when I'm on calls with folks of sort of what I'm thinking and what I think they should be thinking. Every now and then I swap those out, and one of them is get the money up front. That's very subtle for select calls every now and then, but I swap them out.
Sorry, I just had to ask, but yeah.
No, I love your signs. I note when they rotate, by the way, and I noted that was a different one.
Yeah.
And that it was also in the colors of your beloved Georgia Bulldogs.
That's right, yeah. There's a lot of red and black around this house.
The Georgia Bulldogs, for the uninitiated, is the University of Georgia's American football team that has been one of the top 3 teams in the country for the last 4 or 5 years. So, Jason's a dedicated fan. That's
right. I graduated from there. I was in the journalism school and studied public relations, and now I'm on the board of the journalism college over there. And when they called me to invite me to be on the board, I was like, "Hey, y'all already have my transcripts, right? Like, how did I get this invitation?" So I love going over there.
Because you are employee experienced.
Yeah, so I love going over there for those kind of meetings where I don't have to pack the back of my truck with fried chicken and bourbon. I'm not going for a tailgate.
Oh, brilliant. Mike, do you want to kick off?
Sure. As you know, the name of our podcast is Navigating Disruption. And I guess a legitimate first question is, how disruptive are things looking like on your side of the pond at the moment?
Wow. Well, I mean, y'all get media. Y'all have the internet over there, right? So I think you're seeing a lot of the same things that we're seeing. I think, at least, in my narrow-minded kind of experience, I think folks over here think, all right, it's an election year, presidential election, and as soon as that gets decided, no matter which way that decision goes, then okay, poof, all the uncertainty is over because now, we know who won. But the reality is that that's when it all actually begins, regardless of who won. And so, every 4 years, it just feels like companies slow down, the economy slows down, big decisions kind of slow down and wait until that gets decided. And because it's the first part of November, then of course it's, the end of the calendar year, which is already kind of slow for a lot of organizations. People are running out of budgets, they're tidying up whatever it is they promised to do for the year and kind of coasting until the 1st of January. So the two of those things, I think, have left people with a little bit of extra time to think, all right, so now what does all this mean? And I think disruption and change and certainly uncertainty are all things that people are mulling in their minds right now.
So you mentioned uncertainty as an alternative to change. And my dad was a sports writer for the Wall Street Journal, and he got corrected early in his career when he said the future is uncertain, and the editor said the future's always uncertain. Damn it.
Right.
So what's different about this uncertainty than the usual uncertainty?
Gosh, that's such a great question, and there's 300 million people here, and there's probably 300 million different answers for that here in the U.S. But for me, at least, it's there's change, and let's just use a couple of analogies here. Like there's change, so I'm driving along, and the speed limit's 35 miles per hour, and then get a little bit further along, and now it's 50, and so those kinds of changes, I think people are kind of used to, in their personal lives and in their work lives as well. But lately, and when I say lately, last several years probably, and certainly going forward, it feels like, all right, I'm driving along, and the speed limit sign says 35 miles an hour, and then I keep going, and then the next sign says, get out of your car. You now have to use square tires. And you're like, okay, I don't even know where to get square tires. They don't make. I can't go fast with these things. Somehow you figure that out. You keep going, and then there's another sign that says, all right, now you have to go underwater. Like there's change, and people expect that to happen, and that has become sort of certain as to what kinds of change to expect. But it feels like all this uncertainty is like change with a turbo on it, because you don't know what the change is going to be, and it may be so left field that it's hard to even think about it, much less prepare for it.
I was just going to jump in there in that kind of concept of employee experienced, which I love as a term. Are you saying that a lot of time we sort of say, oh, things go in cycles, so we've seen this before and therefore we know how to deal with this? What is different about this cycle? Is it still a cycle that we're like, oh, we've actually still got some of those tools that we know we can unpack? Can we still use some of those same tools? Or do we need, and do communication professionals need new, different tools? And what are they and where do they get them?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because, there's always the conversation in our industry about tools and channels and how best to reach folks. And I think, the tool set that we have now is great. The tool set that we had 10 years ago was also great. The tool set we'll have 10 years from now will also be great. I think the difference is that it's the mindset change that seems to be going through so much of corporate culture and impacting employees and their experience at work. And channels are great, and the tools that we have to have these conversations with our employees, and for them to obviously have conversations with us back, they're all fantastic. But I think what the real uncertainty and the real shift has been is around all this noise, not just in the company, but when you're not at work, all this other stuff that's going on, all of it's just been, if there's a volume knob, it's just been turned all the way up to 10 now. And so used to, it felt like, all right, all this crazy stuff is going on in the world around me, but I can go into work and I can be kind of insulated from that stuff, at least for 8-10 hours a day, maybe. But now everybody's bringing all that into work with them. And, right or wrong, good or bad, humans being humans, of course you're going to do that. And now that brings an extra layer of distraction, disruption, other things to think about besides, whatever the company is paying me to get accomplished on their behalf. And it just makes it hard. We all, certainly the two of y'all and three of us, we all talk about kind of cutting through the noise and breaking through all the clutter and all that. But that's really hard to do when the world, however you define that, just keeps piling on more noise and more clutter,
Yeah.
Well, that whole question of noise raises a very related but distinct issue, which is what's happening to the tone. Because not only are we having all this noise out there, but, my sense is that we're about to see a big time shift in the tone. Already I'm hearing it from people in the future of work world who are saying, the first thing we're going to see happen is that there are going to be a lot of return to office mandates hitting the streets in January. And, there's a lot of stuff that's in play in terms of DEI, particularly in the U.S., sustainability more globally. Are you seeing, any bubblings of any changes of tone, and how could you see, big time changes of tone impacting our world as communication leaders in particular?
Absolutely. And specifically around that return to work, return to office. I mean, we all wish we could escape work, so it's not really return to office. I would like to return to winning the lottery, and then nobody would ever hear from me again, including all your listeners here who would probably appreciate that. But this return to office thing, the whole U.S. government, they brought on Elon Musk and a couple of other people, and their focus over the next 2 years is going to be how to drive, more efficient and more sort of digitally focused, kind of government operations. And one of the very first things that they just started talking about this week was there will be return to office mandates for these federal employees. And we could debate that forever, but what that's going to do is, all right, if I'm a CEO of a company and that's good enough for the government, now I've got sort of cover to say, well, we're going to do it too because they're doing it. That makes it kind of easier now, I think, to slide into that. But ultimately, because we all know you can get stuff done when you're not in the office, and in some ways, faster, better, more productive. All the numbers that everybody's done since the pandemic show that. But I think what that is an example of, because of all the uncertainty, that is one thing that we feel like we can control if I'm a CEO of an organization. So I'm going to do that, and at least I have that under control, because I, as a CEO, feel like I have very little control on a daily basis now already. So that's one thing that I can check off and say, at least everybody's here, and I can make decisions based on that versus that also being a wild card for me.
Do you think that speaks to perhaps a willingness or an acceleration of leaders leading into their own authoritarian impulses? Or do you think that there's going to be some caution around that given what we've learned over the last 5 or so years?
That is a really good point, and I think it's probably some of that. What you just said. Yes, I think there's some of that. But I think the other part of it is okay, if whatever reason they're thinking about doing that, whatever's influencing that decision, what is the equal and opposite reaction that is going to happen? And prior to this year, certainly since the pandemic, it's sort of been an employee's market. Well, all right, if you're going to make me go back to the office, then I can just go and do something else easily. Now, job market's a little tighter, not just here in the U.S., but globally. Not everywhere, but certainly most places. So that makes it a little bit, harder for the employees to have that kind of control and influence over that decision. That is cyclical. That will change. It comes and goes just like everything else does, and that pendulum will swing the other way here probably soon enough, where it will be, now it's more of an employee's market and not an employer's market. But I think some of it, Mike, is exactly what you just described. But I think a lot of the times those decisions get made without fully understanding what is the equal and opposite reaction that is going to happen if you do that, and are you prepared for that, and are you okay with that? So turnover, competitors steal your folks, there's a whole lot of things that happen when you make that kind of decision. And if you factor that in, that's one thing. But if you're surprised by that, then, that's what you get.
Hello, thanks for tuning in to another episode. If you're enjoying the podcast, we'd love your support in helping us reach more listeners. The best way to do that is hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. It's completely free and means you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's content, we'd love you to take a second to leave us a rating or a review. Your support really makes a difference in helping others discover this podcast. Plus, it lets us know what resonates with you so we can keep bringing you more of what you care about. Thanks and take care from me, Janet in London, and Mike in Iceland.
So do you see this shifting in creating perhaps some better opportunity for communication leaders, particularly for internal comms folks, to, you know, get more stuck in around these issues and make a better case for our existence than, you know, just simply what we've been doing, which is, you know, or at least where the market's been going around, you know, getting a bunch of young multi-skilled employees and kind of shunning the more senior bods off into the pasture. Do you see that perhaps the more volatile environment could be a time of opportunity for people in, for lack of a better term, our position?
I certainly think so. And I've thought that for a while, not just recently. And it's primarily because, I think you both have heard me say this, brand equals experience squared. And so it's the combination of the customer experience and the employee experience. And those two things together define the brand internally, and externally. And so if you think about how companies make decisions about customers and the customer experience, it's very thoughtful, it's very data driven. It's, there's a lot of, insights and things that we know about our customers that we should also know about our employees. And that is where our opportunity is. And, if we want to call our industry internal comms or whatever the right word for it is. But that's what's missing, is if the company is trying to decide what they're going to do for customers, then there are all kinds of points of view and tons of data about how that decision might impact things. What if we tweak this one little thing? What will that do? What if we tweak this one little thing? What will that do? They know all of that about their customers. They know next to nothing about their employees. So if we want to have, for example, return to office, we don't know enough about our employees to even decide what the equal and opposite reaction is going to be, because no one is keeping their pulse on who our employees truly are and what they want, the way we do with customers. And that is a huge opportunity for us as internal communications folks. And people will go, well, isn't that HR's responsibility? Actually, it's everybody's responsibility. If you're a leader in that company, you need to know people who work there and what they do and what they feel and what they want. And so I think that is the biggest opportunity, Mike, is what can we learn about our employees so that when we are making decisions that impact them and their experience, it's from a position of strength and knowledge and insight, and not just guessing based on very limited data.
So is this a sense of, because we know that a lot of internal comms, if we're looking internally right now, we know that a lot of internal communication professionals have been, as Mike said, there's been a drive to more junior people, a drive to smaller teams who might say, we don't have time to do that. We don't have time. Is this a sense of figuring out who your allies are and actually working and collaborating within the organization so that you create a stronger business case? Is it something like that? And how would you go about doing something like that?
Definitely, Janet. You definitely have to figure out who those allies are. Certain ones are obvious: HR, IT, but operations. Anybody who is dealing directly with your employees on a daily basis are your biggest allies. And I think because we've got sort of smaller teams, and in some cases, like you said, Janet, more junior folks, or as I like to say, emerging leaders.
That's a lovely way of saying
right?
it. We shall adopt that.
That's right. They're not the established leaders yet. They're the emerging leaders. And so what that means is that, you just said they're smaller teams and they're way more busy. They have more on their plate than they can probably handle. But those are decisions that they also own. Every other function decides what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. We are the same kind of a function. So if we want to spend less time doing arts and crafts kind of stuff, because we want to understand and know and appreciate our employees even better, I don't know that anybody's going to argue with that decision. So if you're too busy to do that, then stop doing some of the stuff that you're doing and don't even ask permission for that, because you run your own function, and then go and start doing this other stuff, because we all know, including them, that is incredibly valuable exercise for us to do.
But don't you see leaders as perhaps being at least at least in the first half of this coming year, perhaps more inclined to poo-poo this stuff and just say, we're going to tell them what to do and they're going to do it, God damn it. That's kind of the vibe that I'm getting from, even like Brian Chesky over at Airbnb,
Airbnb.
as you mentioned in a previous conversation, Janet, saying, you know what, all of this stuff about hiring good people and letting them get on with it, I'm backing away. I'm going back into founder mode. I suspect that's not an undue occurrence. And I guess the question I have is, if that's the case, what do we as a tribe need to be doing to be that equal and opposite reaction to that kind of mode without getting ourselves shot in the process?
Yeah. Well, I think that, what you just described happens in a lot of places all the time, where the leadership thinks that way and the cultures are that way. And, that's just the way it is in some places. But part of that is, for the comms people, I think, is to understand, all right, the leaders, CEO, the founders, whoever they are, have decided that this year, next year, whatever it is, this is what our focus is going to be, and we're going to tighten all this stuff up, and it's going to be very narrow. Like it or not, that's what's been decided. So if that's what's been decided, fully understand what the business decisions are and the strategy and the priorities this year, next year, the year after that. And every single thing that you do needs to be attached to supporting that. Yeah. Which does two things. One, it really demonstrates that you're a partner, a business partner, not just a comms partner, but a business partner, because you understand what we're trying to do and the impact that can have and what you can do to help us do that. But then the other thing that it does is that it then gives you license to say no to anything else that doesn't ladder up to those priorities. And that's where we get into all kinds of trouble all the time, because, almost to a person in this industry, we all have servant spirits. We want to do the right thing. We want to be helpful. We want to, make things as good as we can possibly make them. I mean, we'll go to page 38 in the AP style book to say, all right, should the comma be in the front or the back? Like, that's how interested we are in making this right. But that specific example does not add value to that CEO or that founder who's looking at trying to drive these numbers on the dashboard. So the more you can align everything you're doing with that, I think the better off you're going to be, and the easier it will be for you to be able to say no, because then they'll see, all right, when they say yes to these things, these good things happen. But when they say yes to these things over here, that distracts them. They don't need to be doing that. And the more you can demonstrate that, the more they'll support you in deciding that way.
So really, if I get what you're saying, the opportunity that even a push towards more authoritarian leadership styles presents is the ability for communication leaders to align themselves with that efficiency push, to demonstrate the extent to which we can accelerate that, refine that, sharpen that, and the extent to which we can align with pushing back on other agendas. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, Janet, do you agree with that too?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's interesting because one of the things that you talked about earlier was noise. And I've always been of the opinion that if what you're pushing out doesn't actually align to some of those strategic priorities and things that are actually going to ultimately drive revenue, isn't that just noise?
So potentially, it certainly is for the people who are waiting on the money.
What's it adding to the organization? So actually what we're saying here is that there's some sort of getting back to some fundamentals of your strategic internal communication strategy, plan, whatever, or strategy and plan actually need to ladder up to the strategic priorities of the business, which means that you need to be talking to the director of strategy, head of strategy, not just the C-suite, and actually being able to access that information so that you can understand, all of these things align, they all ladder up, they're all going to support the business, therefore I should be not safe, because nobody's job is 100% safe, we don't live in that world, but I should be in a position where I can prove the ROI of what I'm doing.
Absolutely. And I think the word safe is really helpful in this conversation because the more you can show that what you're doing is actually driving numbers that those people care about, the safer you are, you know? Usually,
Yeah, it's a relative scale. Yeah.
That's right. When they start deciding about who stays and who goes, it's almost always the people who are attached to the money who stay. So attach your ass to the money and you will be a lot safer, you know?
Yeah.
And the best way that comms people can attach their ass to the money is to understand how we make money, to understand what our priorities are, and to do all the things that comms can do to help drive the results of those things and translate those complicated things that they talk about down in that corner office out for the rest of the employees who can then also align themselves around that.
I also think we've got the tagline for this episode: "Attach your ass to the money."
Right.
Well, I'm gonna play contrarian here for a second.
Of course, Mike. I love that part about you.
Obviously.
I mean, you know, we as communication pros, and particularly we in the internal comms world, have been trying to play the ROI game for the last 5-10 years. And part of the challenge that we have is that the amount of money that we actually spend isn't enough, or not just that we spend, but also that we can attribute directly to our efforts, is often not enough to get a CFO out of bed in the morning. You know, it's like, you know, we have, say, $100,000 to spend on a platform. Maybe we've got a $300,000 budget. In an organization that's got $3 billion of revenue, that's a bar tab in Davos. You know, a lot of what I'm hearing is that, you know, we need to move away from ROI and focus on risk, focus on how having an effective communication approach mitigates risk, keeps your organization from blowing up, keeps people from dying on oil platforms and what have you. Yeah. You know, it's not saying that leaning into one necessarily blows up leaning into the other, but, you know, are you seeing any appetite for that? Or do you think we should be trying to stimulate the appetite for that?
I think there's always been appetite, but the leaders don't know how to describe that to us because, you know, they're not us. They're not you know, we are. So I think we have to do a better job of defining that and describing that for them. So, Mike, you just brought up a great point. And I just said this on a webinar a couple of weeks ago. Leaders only care about 3 things: driving revenue, controlling costs, and managing risk. That's it. Those are the 3 magic things that all those leaders care about. So when we talk about aligning ourselves with our priorities and the business strategy and driving the KPIs that matter, every single one of them can be defined by 1, 2, or all 3 of those things. And so even if we only have a budget of 300,000 or 300, it doesn't matter. It's what we are doing to help drive those 3 things that the business is focused on. That's how we show what our value is, not, oh, well, we can nip and tuck $10,000 here or $20,000. Like, nobody's going to care. That's not enough to keep the lights on for 15 minutes in most organizations. But what we can do is say, you know what, we're not going to spend any more time on this foolishness over here. You can do your own PowerPoints. We're not the PowerPoint factory over here. You can do your own stuff. What we're going to do instead is make sure that all of our employees, particularly in this particular business, which is either the best one or the worst one, truly understand what we're trying to do and how they can do any of that better. Then that's when that effort starts showing up on the bottom line. And there are ways that you can have a direct effect on that and an indirect effect on that. But in both cases, you have to take credit for that. So there's causation. We comms did this and this good thing happened. And then there's correlation. We and a bunch of other people did this good thing and good things happen. In both situations, you have to take credit for it. Otherwise, they're going to credit to all the other people and they're not going to understand the true dollar value of what it is that you're doing to help drive success around there. You have to claim that.
So what's the missing ingredient that's keeping us from doing that?
There's 2 to me. A, I don't know how to do it. Like, I don't know how to figure out how I made money, lost money, whether anybody cares one way or the other. And then the second one is, I think people are just too damn shy. I don't want to take credit for something that I didn't exactly do. Well, nobody does, but everybody else does it. But every other function does that. So now you're
It's
just saying I'm claiming the credit for the part of what I know I did as
yeah.
part of this overall effort that other people were also involved in. If you never claim any of that credit, then your balance is always going to be zero, and then other people are going to take your share of that money and add it to their balance.
It's really interesting that you say that, Jason, because I was working in a big organization and internal comms was kind of the last hope to figure something out. And we figured it out, and that meant that that part of the organization made the quarter.
Mm-hmm.
And when we came back into a bigger conversation, because we were part of the marketing team at the time, we didn't blow our own trumpet, and it was the marketing team who had been unable to do anything because it was too late. There wasn't enough time. It was the marketing team who shone the spotlight on us. Because actually we were still part of the whole wider marketing team. So we couldn't do anything, but this other part of our team can do something.
Yeah.
And I think there's absolutely, you've got to have allies and really strong relationships, so that if you're not prepared to stand up and go, hey, we were part of that, who is it at C-suite who will stand up and say, you know what, they did a really good job on this?
Yeah.
Who is it of your partners that will say, actually, it was the partnership and the collaboration I had with this group, and internal comms or corporate comms, who actually, it was all of that together that made the difference. Yeah. Because if your partners aren't doing that and they aren't helping shine a spotlight on you, your relationships aren't strong enough.
Yep. That's a great point, Janet. I completely agree with that. You got to blow your own trumpet, and it has to be a tune that people want to hear. And that's it.
I love
They
that.
don't want just a bunch of loud noise coming from this trumpet. It needs to be the song that they want to hear.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
that whole conversation about the inability of communication pros to cross the gap between what they do and how people see it. It kind of runs in, it seems to run counter to what I think is probably your all-time best line, Jason, which is that communication is the courage department. Why the gap?
Yeah. I don't know the psychology behind it, although when anybody wants to have a webinar about imposter syndrome, about 8.3 million internal communicators sign up for it. So I think there's something about the psychology that makes internal comms people totally different from external comms people or marketing people or whatever, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine. People are people and they should be themselves. However, if you wake up every morning and think, all right, I'm naturally not going to blow this trumpet, then your mindset needs to be, you know what? I wake up every morning and I'm going to play. And I'm going to go to this desk or this office and I'm going to put on this costume and I'm going to say these lines so that this play, wins a Tony Award. And then when I go home, I can be as quiet. I can read books. I can sit there with my cat and just, not do any of that stuff, all of which is fine. But the reality is that that's the way the corporate world works. And if you are not automatically built that way, perfectly fine. But you have to pretend like you are if you're going to be able to get that credit and get the resources and, get all the things that you need to help drive your success, your team's success, the company's success. And that, to me, is where the courage comes in. Despite my fears, I still need to do this because it's important. That, to me, is what courage is. And so we ourselves have to have that before we can expect the other leaders to have that. Because if we're not demonstrating that and they're looking to us, we have to help them. And we can't help them if we ourselves don't feel that way. And even if that's counter to your personality or how you kind of navigate the world every single day, you're just going to have to scrunch things up and do it because it matters. It matters to your success, and it's certainly going to matter to the rest of the organization's success.
Want to explore the burning questions your C-suite and clients are asking? Then you should consider the next Navigating Disruption Mastermind. Janet and I will challenge and coach you in an 8-session program. You'll join other Navigating Disruption listeners and other senior comms pros. For more information, follow the Navigating Disruption page on LinkedIn.
It's interesting. What you just said made me think of what Advaita Patel posts about quite a lot, which is the people pleasing.
Yeah. Yeah, she's
Hi,
great
we
about
want to,
that.
we want to talk to you, we want to help, we want to be, but you're doing it at the detriment of yourself. So you're helping, you're putting yourself under the cosh, you're putting yourself in a position where sometimes you can't deliver what is being asked, or you don't have the resources to be able to achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve, or you haven't even defined those outcomes because you're so busy trying to just push stuff out in a reactive way.
Yeah.
And actually, that's not people pleasing. That's not people pleasing at all. It gives you the sort of the instant, it's almost like the sugar rush thing, isn't it? It's like, it gives you the instant rush of like, I've just had a big bite of a donut, boom, I've got the sugar. But actually what you need is something that is sort of slightly more slow release carb. And actually that is, the slow release carb is going to give you a better outcome ultimately with your business partners.
Yeah.
And the people pleasing bit, you're going to tick a box, but it's going to be forgotten instantly, in the same way that those sugar calories are going to be, gone instantly. And I think that's kind of a really interesting kind of piece as well. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting was you sort of talking about, you need to know if that's not what you feel. I think, is there something here around, do actually internal communicators, have they done enough professional development, or not professional, but personal development, to understand how they think, how they behave, who they are, so that they understand, I know that bit's going to require a bit more energy.
Yeah.
I know that bit I can do really easily. I know that bit I need some mentoring with. I know that bit I'm actually going to go and look for allies to help me. So are you actually kind of creating your own personal board, or whatever that might look like, to do that? Because I know that for me, for example, I'm exactly the person that you just described. Everyone goes,
I am too.
People
think I'm crazy when I say that, but I am too. I have to pretend all day long because
Absolutely.
I need other people to be comfortable pretending. So I have to do that myself. I get it.
Yeah, I have to kind of bring the energy, and then after I've brought the energy all day, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to go and sit, and I'm just going to go quiet. I'm not going to talk to anyone. I don't want to talk to anybody.
100%. That's exactly right.
For a good couple of hours.
And I think
that's because I understand that about myself.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because I have no data to back this up other than 35 years of seeing this. But if you look across, corporate America, corporate world, however we want to define that, and look at who the CCOs are, I would guess that less than 5%, maybe even smaller than that, came up through internal comms. They came up through external comms. They were really good at media relations, and then they got really good at crisis, and then maybe they dabbled over in investor relations, all of which is important. And maybe they did a little bit of internal comms, but we collectively, listening here, wouldn't consider them an internal comms person. I think that's why there aren't any more CCOs than there already are who came up on the internal side, is because we are not built that way. And when we don't force ourselves to at least play nice and pretend like that's how we are, then that's why we're not going to get those jobs. That's why we're not going to be the CCO, because the people who are built that way are doing those things and they're getting those jobs. And right now, I don't know any company on this planet that doesn't need a CCO who has more internal experience than external. And that's not happening for this very reason.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it also, coming back to what you sort of said earlier about CEOs and C-suite and what they're spending all the money on the customers. They know they've got all the data for the customers, but they don't have that for the employees. And it's almost the same there. Everything gets channeled externally because you get loads of opportunity to do, and the opportunities aren't there. And we're fighting for the opportunities for internal comms, knowing how important it can be. But if that's how you're viewing the customer versus the employee, then...
Right.
Yeah.
Which has always been so weird to me, because, CEOs think, okay, I'm going to put an externally focused person in the CCO job, because in that person, the CEO's mind, hey, if we send press releases out, then money happens, right? There's no research that shows that. There's no research that shows that any more than there's research that says, hey, we're going to send out this internal newsletter, and then people are going to automatically love living here, working here. There's no research that shows that, but they think that. I don't know if I send a press release out if somebody, buys a hammer at Home Depot because I said so, but that's what they think. And if that's what they think, then we have to play that same game. I think a lot of times we try to play the game of changing how they think. We've been playing that way too long, and we have a losing record. So what do we do to play the game that they're playing, which is, all right, if they want more of that kind of stuff, then we can do that as long as it's aligned here. And then over time, then they also then begin to see that, all right, I don't know how, but if these people send out this newsletter, that helps our culture be stronger. And then that translates into money. That's the exact same thought process for sending out press releases, which makes our brand and marketing look stronger, and that leads to money. Same thing, they already trust one, and they have no idea why the other one is true. That's another opportunity for us.
Well, there's also another piece of this, though, which is that there's, and this is particularly true of the American companies with which I've worked, and that is the control myth. That, externally, you acknowledge that you don't own your external stakeholders, that you have to engage with them on their terms. But at the same time, internally, and this is kind of why I'm a bit worried about the change in tone, and, certainly in the US at the moment, that you can double down on this idea that I own my employees and they're going to do what I tell them to do, God damn it, or they'll walk, or I'll find other people who will.
Yeah.
And to me, we have to be able to address that mentality as well as, outperform our external peers in terms of the stuff that we're doing.
Well, that's a great point, and you're exactly right. And if that's the way some companies are going to want to play it, then they're going to find out fairly quickly that just like with their brand externally, like you say who you think your brand is. That doesn't matter. Your brand is what your customers think it is. Same thing inside the organization. You say this is what our culture is. Doesn't matter. It's what your employees say it is. And so they spend a lot of time trying to earn that from customers, and you have to spend just as much time to earn that from your employees. Just because you pay them doesn't mean you own them. And they'll be very quick to say, you know what, I'm leaving, I'm retiring, I'm going down the street, I'm just going to go home and sit there. Like, that is now an option when it didn't used to be. It's a little bit tighter right now, but it is still an option. And so the more they kind of clamp down like that, you're going to do it because you work here and I told you to do it. That doesn't work. It's never worked. And so, as I tell my team all the time, you have to have a lot of patience while the client finally comes to your conclusion. Same thing here. That CEO is going to have a lot of patience, while they're doing that, and then people are walking out the door till they finally come to our conclusion about that. They'll learn.
Well, one thing you're doing in some of your work, though, actually could be a nice little point of leverage in this broader conversation, and that's the work that you're doing with internal influence, which is one of my favorite things in the world, one of my specialties. Yeah. To what extent are you having traction with leaders talking about this stuff, and why?
It is a hard conversation to initiate, but once you start having that conversation, the light bulbs go on a lot faster and a lot brighter. And so here's an example. So you go in and you say, hey, I know everybody here thinks that you need to cascade all your communications down. You got to have all your leaders lined up, and you got to give them talking points, and the same thing that everybody's been doing, for 80 billion years. Not that it's wrong, but that doesn't mean it's right either. And so the premise is, all right, you think that just cascading through all those leaders is going to reach people and influence them. The reality is that there are a ton of other people in that organization who may or may not be leaders who are way more influential. And when you say this to the leaders, and those people are the ones that everybody goes to for the meeting after the meeting, that's who your internal influencers are. Everybody in that organization knows who they are. Sometimes those influencers themselves know who they are. Nobody else knows who they are. HR doesn't know who they are. Senior leaders don't know who they are because they think it's them. Sometimes it is. Oftentimes it is not. CEO does the town hall and says this, that, and the other thing, and somebody sitting there goes, well, oh, that's great and good, but I don't know what to think till I go talk to Mike, and then Mike will tell me what to think, and then that's what I'll think. So those people have an outsized influence on what happens in the rest of the organization, and they're about 3% of any company's population, but then they can influence the other 90%. As opposed to leaders, which are about 12% of any employee population, they can only influence about 50%. So if all you're doing is going through your leaders, you're only reaching 50% of the people. And even they are going to go and talk to their influencers and say, is this bullshit or not? So you need to know who those 3% are, because they're the ones that are really having the impact on the majority of the organization. And it's not who you think they are. And the other thing about it is, depending on your culture, it's just like Fight Club. Yeah, first rule of Fight Club is let's don't talk about Fight Club. As soon as you say, hey, Janet, you're an influencer, and then everybody knows that, they're like, well, I'm not going to Janet anymore. She's been a double-knot spy this entire time, and I can't trust her now. So they are already influential. Don't try to do anything with them other than know that, and let that be enough.
Well, that's interesting in and of itself, because, I mean, when I'm involved in these types of projects, I tend to give slightly different advice. The first advice I give is, if you've identified the influencers, you need them to know that you know. I think that's critical.
Depends on the culture, but you're right. Yeah, I completely agree myself.
Partially because it provides license to change that relationship between them. So it's like, for example, if you've got 600 influencers in an organization of 10,000, you want to have your leaders talking to and listening to these people more often than just simply kind of doing the tick box employee engagement survey. Even if you're not exposing these people, to the rest of the audience, knowing that they know that you're, that you're central. The other thing is, if you're going through an M&A or something like that, these are the people you want to keep at all costs.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think it's, depends on the culture, depends on the situation, stuff like, some cultures is perfectly fine. Other cultures, as soon as you say, here are influencers, and there's a whole list of leaders who aren't on there, they're mad. But the reality is that that's a different kind of relationship. You're not asking me that question. You're asking me, who do I get my information from and who do I trust the most? And I say, it's this person over here who might be a peer. They may even be more junior than I am. That has nothing to do with my relationship with my leader. I think of that differently. It's like, hey, your mom or your dad versus, your brother or sister or your cousin. Like, all those relationships are important. All those people are, important in your life, but some have outsized influence compared to others. It doesn't mean the others aren't good at what they do. It just means that your employees think of those people differently.
Yeah, I've worked in a couple of different organizations where one CEO absolutely didn't agree with influencers, very command and control. I'm in charge, everyone should listen to me. He was then replaced by somebody who had more EQ in his little finger than the former CEO had in his whole body. And he identified very quickly, I know that there are other people who people listen to. I want to know who they are. I don't want to try and exert influence on them, but I want to bring them into the fold and have conversations. I want to see what I can learn from them. Yes. And that was one of the smartest things I ever saw that CEO do, was actually understand his limits. And not because, as you say, not because he wasn't a good CEO, but because that's just, this other person was in a position of influence that he could never get to. Right. Ever. Yeah. Because of various different reasons. And then the other thing is, if you ever, one organization, we did a load of focus groups about, where do you get your information from? Just tell us, where do you get your information from? Mm-hmm. And the amount of people who, and it was a huge percentage of people who, yes, some got it from their manager, but some would get it from, oh, well, I know Fred, and Fred always listens really well. Yeah. At the team briefing or at the huddle or whatever. So actually, because I don't listen very well, I always ask Fred. Mm-hmm. And if Fred's not on the same shift as me, I'll always make sure I find Fred, because Fred will tell me what's going on that day. That's and if Fred's not in, I just have 2 days where I don't do, I don't bother with those days. But then I wait for Fred, because Fred's all over it, and I trust Fred. And it's exactly the way social media works.
You're exactly right. And I think, too, as communicators, we get very nervous with stuff like that because, people aren't reading the newsletter, or they're not going to the internet site or whatever. But somehow everybody knows what's going on. So just because Mike's not going there every day and consuming the 80,000 pieces of cool content that we throw out there every hour doesn't mean that he's not getting what he needs from somebody else who is. That's fine. That's,
Exactly.
what's that old term in pass along readership or whatever that metric was? This is the same kind of concept. Everybody
Yeah.
doesn't have to read it as long as the most important people do, and they tell them, which they're already doing.
Yeah.
So I don't care if 10 people are looking at the internet. If it's the right 10 people, I can reach everybody.
How do you think we
100%.
can adjust our measurement suite to reflect this more accurately?
Well, it goes back to what you said earlier, which is about, knowing who the influencers are and understanding what their roles are and if they themselves are consuming that stuff. Because, that's what really matters. Like people spend, you and I and Jan, we've all just discussed the travesty that is employee engagement industry. And it is an industry. That's all it is. It's an industry. Because people are like, oh, our engagement scores are only 40% or they're only 70% or whatever it is that it is, and it should be something else. My very first question is, A, who cares? Because that's a measure that is never right. And B, who are the ones that are most engaged? And if that's a small subset of the rest of the organization, fine. I don't care how many are engaged. I want to know which ones are the most engaged and are they the right ones? And if I've got them at 100% and most everybody else is at 20, 30, 40%, great. That's a lot of upside. But I don't know I don't know that unless I go to the trouble to find out who all these people are and all that kind of stuff. So people would just worry a lot about, all these channels and the engagement score. As long as you got the right people, that's good enough. It's like an extension of the team. We don't have to try to reach everybody with all this stuff. We just need to reach these people, and they'll reach everybody else in their own way, which is good enough.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. And you mentioned the whole kind of fundamental bullshittiness of the whole employee engagement game. But I actually see that the most dangerous kind of employee engagement scores are the ones that are most inflated. And for me, they're dangerous for two reasons. A, it makes it a lot more difficult to find the people who are actually engaged because everybody's, gaming the questions and trying to show how engaged they are. Yeah. The second is that organizations that get high engagement scores give their leaders a license not to change. Oh, we've got a 70, 80, 90% engagement score. We don't have to adjust the comp and bends. We don't have to clean up the cafeteria. We don't have to give the influencers access to the management reports. We're doing fine. Is that something you see as well?
All the time. All the time, Mike. All the time. Let's pretend for a second. Let's say there's 10 employee engagement, vendors on the planet. And if you ask each of them how they define employee engagement, you're going to get 10 different answers. Well, the reality is there's probably 5,000. So you're going to get 5,000 different answers of what employee engagement is. So when this company says our employee engagement scores are this, well, okay, but what does that mean compared to anybody? There's no standard. There's no definition of what employee engagement is. Like if we want to know what the speed of light is, there's a formula that tells us that and the whole world agrees, right? Or, hey, I'm going to make an RC and this is how it's different from a Pepsi. Like we know exactly the specifics of what that means and we all agree to that. No one agrees on what employee engagement even is. No one can even agree on the definition of it. So how are you relying on something that the industry itself can't define other than their own little brand around what that is to help make decisions by asking people who are A, going to lie, and B, may not be the people that you want to be engaged to begin with. So the whole thing's just flawed, if you ask me.
So this makes me think of what you're saying. And we started off this conversation talking about, are you aligning with the right things? Are you making sure that you're kind of safe or as safe as you can be on a relative scale? When I've worked in-house, I've always rejected employee engagement as a score to measure as a KPI because there are so many other things that could impact that. It's not just all about
the hour.
So why am I?
By the hour.
Am I? Oh, I could have a bad train journey to work, be given my engagement and give it awful because I've actually just got off a really dreadful train journey and I'm feeling awful and dreadful and
yeah.
And I've always had that sort of sort of point of view that there's always going to be some people who are feeling bad, who are not feeling great, who are having a bit of a lull, who are not feeling engaged. So there should automatically be a percentage of people who are not promoters, who are not shouting from the rooftops how great you are, because of just life and everything that's going on there.
That's right.
So if we are aligning as a function to a score, as you've just described, which is, I can't think of the right word. Then are we not putting ourselves in the danger zone? Are we not? Is that not something? Is that not a practical thing that we could say to communication professionals? Actually, this is something you need to. If you want to have it, great, but you need other really serious business grounded revenue, commercial, whatever that might be, ways of measuring what you do.
Yeah.
Because that's actually what's going to make you safer. Not safe, but safer.
Yeah, I love that. I agree with that. Like, if I went to the doctor and all she did was tell me what my blood pressure was and then say, all right, you're good to go, you're really healthy, and did no other tests, and I just walked out and believed that, I could drop dead the next day of a heart attack. Like, that is one measure of what's happening. That the blood pressure score does not tell me that I am actually healthy. So if you want to do employee engagement and rely on that for something, okay, that's fine. But it's your blood pressure. Like, what's your cholesterol? What's your heart rate? I mean, what are all the other things that make you healthy or not? That is one of them. But every organization thinks it is that thing and nothing else. And that is such bullshit.
I like to describe it as flying an airplane on the basis of the speedometer.
Right.
But there's something that's even a little more insidious about employee engagement surveys that I just feel I have to say, given the conversation that we just had, which is that, particularly if you're using Net Promoter Score, anybody in the organization knows that 8, 9, 10 are your positives. And so a 7 is as bad as a 3. I like to describe a 7 on these scales as a polite 3.
Yeah.
That,
That's a good way to say it.
If you want to demonstrate some degree of displeasure without getting yourself blown up in the process, a 7
you just become passive. You sit yourself in the passive area. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
I think
then
one thing
then the leadership says, "Oh, we've got a 70% engagement score, aren't we? Great. No, you have a 30. Deal with it."
Yeah, and the people who are engaged at 70% are your lowest performers because they don't want to get fired. Congratulations.
I was going to say something, but I've now completely forgotten what I was going to say.
You fully engaged the people who can take you the...
No. I know what I was going to say. So the thing with Net Promoter as well, not to kind of just beat up on Net Promoter, but I worked in an organization which was global. We had several of our countries who culturally will never give above an 8. So that kind of shifted the scores. 8, 7, 6 was 10, 9, 8. But 7 and 6 sat firmly in passive. So when we got back scores to say, well, actually, we're looking at this country and, it's not good in this country. And actually, there's work that needs to be done. How can, as a communications team, how can you help support this one country? And I looked at it and I said, I'm going to go and talk to the country leads and the country manager and we'll have a chat about it. And he said, we will never give a 10 or a 9. So the fact that we're coming out and we've got this number of 8s is actually really, I'm amazed. The fact that we've got this number of 7s and 6s, I'm really happy. But when you gave it back to the mothership, which was a country, if you look at sort of cultural mapping and all that kind of good stuff, which was a country which, 10 is everything is awesome.
Yeah.
It didn't fit because there was no cultural overlay.
Yeah.
And that was hugely important because actually that was a really engaged team.
Yeah.
But within their cultural context.
That's right.
But That story kind of reminds me of the old joke, beatings will continue until morale improves.
Yeah.
That in some
Yeah.
organizations you'd see something like that and you dispatch a squad to fix those scores.
That's right. Yeah. It's like
Yeah.
companies that call up and go, "Oh, we really hate our Glassdoor ratings and reviews. What can we do about that?" And then,
Do better.
some of the things are, "Oh, we can just get employees to go on there and talk about how great it is or whatever. Like, what do you think about that?" It's like, well, it'll look like that's what you did. A better solution is just stop treating people like shit. I mean, that's it. If you want those scores to improve, it's like, hey, we want to be like a best place to work. What do we need to do? All right, step one, be a best place to work. That's it. You can't game the survey
Yeah.
and hope that they'll
Yeah.
give you a good. Just be a best place to work, and then they'll call you up and say, we want to recognize you. Instead of trying to
Yeah.
game the whole thing, just do it.
Well,
Bravo.
that strikes me as as interesting given some of the passive aggressive things that people are doing right now. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things that I've seen with, and perhaps you've seen it as well with return to office mandates, is that return to office mandates on the surface seem like really cheap ways to do layoffs.
Well, that's exactly what Elon Musk said about these U.S. federal employees.
Yeah.
They were like, we're going to make people come back in the office, which will then force voluntary turnover, which will then make the government smaller and easier for us to make it more efficient. Okay, that's fine. That sounds like a pretty good strategy. But that's exactly what's happening in some of these other places, Mike, is that they make that decision knowing that. And in that wave of people who are like, you know what, I am one of these people that's going to quit. Some of those people are people that you do not ever want to quit, but now they're all caught up in that because you weren't selective or thoughtful about that whole decision.
Right, and it's not just simply a firing, it's a betrayal. And if you're concerned about your Glassdoor ratings,
Yeah.
those fours become twos really quickly at that.
And what about the people that lived in Virginia and they were like, okay, you can go work from home now, and that'd be great. And you're like, okay, great. Well, my home is now actually going to be in California. I can finally move there. And then you say, all right, everybody's got to return to the office. Well, are you going to pay to move that guy back from California? I doubt it. So what are you going to do now? It's like the mess we're in right now with manufacturing. The government incentivized companies to set up operations overseas. And now, with tariffs and other things that are being proposed, we want to bring all that back. Okay, that's fine. I don't know that we can become a manufacturing culture anymore because the world has changed. But if that's what you want to do, okay. However, I can't build a plant in 10 minutes. It's going to take me 3 or 4 years to greenfield a new facility because I'm now having to close the one down in China that you gave me money to build over there. So that's why I think people circle all the way back to the beginning of this discussion, is that's the uncertainty that I think that's driving people crazy, is that it was very certain when you said do this, and now you're going to say something else, and now the whole thing is uncertain.
It's interesting because, living in the UK, we had several years of uncertainty and almost what felt like policy by A/B testing. We're going to do this thing, public uproar. We're not going to do this thing because the public has rejected that. And it was that for many years, all the way through COVID. So you've got the addition of everything that's going on in COVID, then coming out of COVID, your policy by A/B testing is the only way I can kind of describe it. And it feels like a little bit like that's what you guys are going to be going through in the US with these great big sort of conversations about we're going to put tariffs on this. We're going to have, whereas I was reading something the other day, and I can't remember where, which is not helpful. I'm sorry, but it talked about how tariffs were proposed in the previous Trump administration. That would have been a major setback for a company like Apple. Apple had a way of, or an agreement with the government, which said that actually we're not going to put tariffs on the things that you want to bring into the country. So that meant that what that does is it sort of so it's kind of interesting because you've got this overcomplication of, well, there's tariffs, but there's not.
Yeah.
And then you want a smaller government, so you want fewer people, but actually you're making their lives more complicated because you're making it's everything is governed by exception. So that feels a little bit like it could be quite tricky.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't want to be too political, and I don't have a dog in any of these fights. My dog is the employees and what's best for them.
Yeah.
But when I was CCO at Newell Brands, in the first Trump administration, that's exactly what happened to us. We moved a lot of our operations and manufacturing overseas, and then they were like, okay, now we're going to put tariffs on that stuff coming back into the country. So now we are, whatever money we saved, quote, saved, by taking these jobs and production and putting it overseas is now going to be way outweighed by the taxes that we are now ourselves going to have to pay to bring our own products into this country. After you already told us, please put them over there and we'll pay you to do it. Now we're being penalized for that decision. I sat right there in those meetings. I mean, that's the kind of uncertainty. It's just this whipsaw stuff that, all right, you want us to do this and we'll make this decision. It's hard to undo some of these things, but you expect us to do it overnight. I can't build a plant overnight. It's going to take me years. And by then, somebody else will be in there and then they'll change their mind. What am I going to do with this half-built plant? It's craziness. Anyway, I guess that's why they sell liquor and beer.
Right, that bourbon you were talking about for the tailgate. I'm thinking that there might be some use for it.
That's right. So all the comms people think, I'm on the whip end of this. Every CEO feels the same way right now. I mean, you look at that Edelman Trust Barometer and, to a person, I trust my CEO because, everything else that they've been leaning on their entire lives feels kind of shaky. So CEOs feel like a safe place. I'm in there all. That's going to start to erode. That score is going to start to erode a little bit because CEOs don't know either.
Yeah,
they don't know
it's
now
wobble,
either.
Isn't it?
Yeah. So all this stuff that's people lean on because it feels kind of sturdy. People are just taking axes to it right now, and maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. I don't know, but the point is that people are taking axes to it, and what we have to do as communicators is help people have the courage to lead through that, no matter what kind of decisions need to be made. And help him translate that for our employees about what they need to do to help the organization stay as flexible and fluid and resilient as possible through whatever it is that's about to happen.
It's interesting.
And that is also true every other year for the next 100 years and the previous. That piece of advice matters. It doesn't matter what's going on in any of the world's capitals. That is true every single day.
It makes me think of that the conversation that we had, Mike, a couple of weeks ago, where we sort of said it's about making sure that people understand and that there is no say-do gap.
Yeah.
And that actually, if it's not what people want to hear, but if it's actually the truth, and it's clear, that's the job. So it might, at least then people can make an informed decision about what they're doing. It's when you, I think the example that we gave was it's when sort of, our people are everything. And then you don't take them into consideration when you're making decisions, or or they raise objections to a decision that you make and you ignore them, or you go on television and say, we don't care what you just said.
Yeah.
Then you don't care about your people, and there is a say-do gap, and that is a major problem. And I think that it kind of comes back to that idea that you just said there, Jason, of what can comms professionals do to help is that they can make sure that it's clear, they can make sure that people understand it, they can make sure that people have the opportunity to understand it, and then it's an employee's decision. It's, after all, a contract. Yes. I bring my good self, my skills, my energy, my vibrancy. You bring the money and the hopefully interesting work.
That's right. That's right. And I think the really hard part about all of this is that most jobs worldwide, it doesn't matter what it is a different, not different, but like the same version of the same thing every single day. And that's why change and disruption and all that is such a barrier for people as employees, for leaders, for companies, whatever, because for any of that to work, it has to be essentially the same thing every day, day in and day out. And when you start changing that, it takes a while for those changes to then kind of settle in. And then now that's the new same, and it's the day in and day out. And then whoop, we're going to do it again. And if you do that every 18 months, that's one thing. But if you do that every 18 minutes, how are you ever going to have the consistency? And the
rapid cycling disruption.
That's right.
You're not.
It's not just uncertainty. There's just no predictability anymore. And I don't know any investor who's going to want to invest in anything that is that unpredictable.
No.
private or public. Like that is way too volatile. And now we're just trying to make volatility the norm every single day. It's not sustainable for companies or humans, quite frankly.
On that note,
I was going to say, now that we've ended with that dystopian little little nugget, do you have any, just as a last thing, because that was actually quite dystopian, glimmers of hope for the communication professional?
Of
for
course.
communication professionals.
Absolutely.
What do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I got up this morning. I'll get up tomorrow morning because I have hope. The whole Star Wars franchise was built around that concept. Same thing with us, That's why we all get up, because we do have a say. We do have a responsibility, whether we're communicators or we're the frontline employees or we're the CEO or whatever. All this stuff is happening around us, to us, by us sometimes. But we also have, some control over that. And so I think what the important thing is that the hope, certainly for communicators, but for any employee, is that, you know what? This is what we all signed up for. This is how society works until you win the lottery. But this is how society works. And so what can we do to work together to get through this and, get to whatever the next better day is? And that's also true every day. That, I don't want anybody to think this is a big political discussion and we're focused on, one administration. This is true every single day. So there needs to be hope every single day, and especially for the communicators, because we're the purveyors of hope and courage across the organization. And if we ourselves aren't hopeful, and if we ourselves aren't courageous, how on earth are we going to help anybody else in that organization be, including the leaders who are probably just as scared shitless right now as anybody else? We have to be that rock. We have to be that steadiness that helps translate all this stuff and keep people from just totally panicking, And that's our hope. That's our opportunity. And that's the mark that we can have on the world. That's not ever going to show up in an engagement survey. Who cares? It's important work and it needs to be done, and we're the people to do it.
I think that is a really great place to stop.
Thank you all so much for having me on here. This might be the longest podcast ever in the history of the world. You might have to have three volumes of it. But I've really enjoyed this conversation.
We are I think we're just over an hour. So we're good. We're good.
We're good.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, thank you all so much for having me on. This has been, I always talk with a bunch of folks and y'all separately. I'm glad we're able to do this together. This is really good.
No, Jason, this is wonderful. It's great to see you.
So we've had a little time to digest the conversation we had with Jason. Do you have any additional thoughts?
I absolutely loved the conversation. I enjoyed it so much. And I think every time that Jason speaks, every time I hear him speak, every time I have a conversation with him, I just want to sit and listen. He is one of the best storytellers. Everything he says is grounded in an understanding of human behavior, an understanding of the employee experience. And he's experienced, with his employee experienced, he has experienced so much, and he brings all of that knowledge and shares it so generously. So I think from my perspective, I absolutely loved it. And every time that man opens his mouth, I want to listen to what he has to say.
I agree, and I think one of the key things about Jason, one of the reasons why I was very keen to have him as a guest, is that, we've got a lot of people in our profession, in our field, who are wondering about what's going to happen next, and they're wondering about how to deal with not just uncertainty, but unpredictability, which is, is one of my themes at the moment. And Jason doesn't offer a lot of answers, but he offers a ton of really good questions. And, he's also somebody who is somebody who has a lot of empathy for his fellow communication pros. I think that's actually one of his exceptional qualities. And, that's why I share your view that the more people listen to Jason, the better off they're going to be.
Excellent. So I think we can finish our Jason love in there. Thank you very much, Jason, for joining the podcast. Universal.
Thank you, Jason.
Loved it.
And thank you, Janet.